Okay, so today we want to talk about moving west. What is continuing to drive this American movement out west? Of course, you will hopefully remember that we started this conversation with Manifest Destiny. The United States already has an established Western presence. So, what happens now that our borders, at least in terms of this Manifest Destiny, east to west, are fairly set? What does the actual settlement of the frontier look like, not just the claiming of the frontier? What is actually done with Native Americans, both out west and that remain in the east? How are they further pushed onto what we know as reservations today? And what are some incentives that Americans might have to move west? So let's start with a conversation about California and address some anti-Chinese immigrant sentiments that exist out west. We talk a lot about anti-immigration in this class. We have in the past for sure, and we will continue to do that as we move forward in history. But usually we're talking about, anti-Irish, anti-Italian, maybe even anti-Catholic, anti-immigration. As we get further in history, we'll be talking about immigration from Mexico and other places being a concern for some Americans. But when we are talking about this time period out west, who is immigrating to the West? It tends to be Asians who come into places like California seeking jobs and work on the railroads, right? Building the railroads. So this is where this anti-Chinese immigration sentiment comes from, and this is where it sort of reaches its fever pitch, is out west. We know the Spanish will begin to settle in California in the 1700s. Catholic missions will be established there. The population will continue to grow in California with the gold rush of 1849. The existing population of Spaniards, now Mexicans, are overwhelmed by newcomers. Many lose land, many lose businesses, and so the Mexican and Mexican Americans that live in California become the poor working class. Migrant workers, oftentimes, of the West. The gold rush, the 49ers, they're also going to attract Chinese immigration who come to the United States through Angel Island. So when we talk about movements, immigration movements into places like New York, we're talking about Ellis Island. And out west, we're talking about Angel Island. As many as 200,000 immigrants were coming through Angel Island per day by the year 1800. Most of them are laborers, and eventually they will start to be seen as competition for jobs. 90% of these immigrants work for the Central Pacific Railroad, which will be completed in 1869. And at that point, many workers move into San Francisco. They tend to live together near each other, and so their neighborhoods are labeled as Chinatowns. There are some groups who operate like we would see political machines operate out west, and you will see a lot of Chinese workers being taken advantage of. Many Chinese immigrant women were forced into prostitution. Hostility, that should say, grows as the population grows. Particularly, you see a lot of Democrats being frustrated and angry with Chinese immigration. In 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Chinese Exclusion Act is going to ban Chinese immigration into the United States for 10 years, and it will prevent the Chinese already living in the country from becoming citizens. It will be a temporary act, but a permanent law in 1902, and the Chinese population in the United States will drop by 40% until it is repealed in 1943. So we think of that as something that is, a very, very long time ago, but it's not repealed until 1943. There is a huge movement west after the Civil War. So the population isn't just being fueled by immigration, it's also being fueled by people in the United States who are living out east, moving out west. A lot of this immigration is encouraged by the Homestead Act of 1862, which is designed to promote economic development out west. Settlers could buy acreage for an extremely reasonable price. So here, 160 acres for $18. The only caveat was that you had to work and live on the land for 5 years, and you must show proof that the land had been improved. This reminds me of, I guess, maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I bought my first house. I'm trying to think. Yes. 9 years ago, the government was offering like tax incentives. Like if you bought a house during that year, because it was like 2008, 2009, if you bought a house during that year, the government would give you like $3,000, but you had to stay in that house for, I think, 2 years and pay your bills on time. So the government will do things like that from time to time. And in this case, in the Homestead Act, it's designed to encourage people to move west. But the problem is 160 acres is not that much when it comes to grazing cattle. So you have the Timber Culture Act of 1873, which allows homesteaders to receive grants of 160 additional acres if they plant 40 acres of trees, and the Desert Land Act of 1877, which allows settlers to buy 640 acres at $1.25 per acre if part of that land was irrigated within 3 years. So government is providing incentives here, pretty good incentives for Western settlement. Let's see here. The Western economy is essentially going to be built on these economic pursuits: mining, ranching, and commercial farming. So let's talk about miners. The miners are out there to get quick wealth. That is not a reality, right? But that's why many people move west, seek their fortunes, and they think it's going to be super quick and they're going to make all this money and then come home. So in the beginning, it's mostly just men who move out there to these mining towns, and they're pretty rough. There's really no law enforcement at all, and it's just these almost like little shanty towns that you would see popping up out west. But eventually there will be more settled communities. But there is a mining boom out west from about 1850 through the 1890s. First it's gold, then it's other minerals like quartz. And here are some places where they do find other kinds of minerals. 1858, gold in Pikes Peak, Colorado, silver in Leadville, Colorado, silver in Nevada. In 1874, gold in the Black Hills in the Dakotas. 1881, copper in Montana. So you can see that there's a lot of different things going on in a lot of different places out west. The thought of striking it rich first brought miners to the west into Colorado, California, and Nevada. Mining continued to attract settlers into the 1800s. Booms are when you find a lot. A bust is when, the supply has been exhausted, and a ghost town is what's left behind when the miners move on. Ranching. There were approximately 5 million cattle in the West by 1865. That's crazy. They are sent to the market in the East because that's where they fetch some pretty good prices. However, how do you get cattle to railroad centers? Because the cattle is being grazed everywhere out west. There's only a few places where they could, be loaded onto a railroad car. And the answer is long drives. So if you've ever seen a cowboy movie where they are moving the cattle, right, from place to place, that is what you're watching. You're watching a long drive. Ranchers would pasture cattle along the route to the railroad in order to transport east. Many are lost, that should say, along the way. And it was made possible by this idea of the open range. Nobody fenced in their land. So all this acreage that you're getting, 160, plus 160, plus maybe even 640 acres of land, for your cattle to graze on, nobody is fencing that in and caring for it. It's just sort of open. And so as these cowboys would take the cattle from the ranch to the railroad station, they would graze on this open range. Soon, though, you will have competition for grass, which will lead to range wars, which will lead to fencing, in particular barbed wire. The invention of and popularity of barbed wire puts an end to the open range. It puts an end to cowboys, and it turns cowboys into settled ranchers. Farming. Railroads are also responsible for the most of the movement west, low prices for settlers moving west. So railroads would be given land, if you remember, by the government. Here's your land, you can build your railroad track here. But they didn't need all that land, and so once the railroad's built, they would sell it pretty cheaply to settlers and also extend easy credit if they couldn't afford to pay cash. Farmers, though, are facing a lot of problems moving out west, enclosing land. Barbed wire means they can't farm land that they don't have a title to. There's also scarce water. It's not as easy to irrigate as you may think. There's a need for deep water pumps in order to have large-scale irrigation. They need some government assistance for that, but there's no will to help from the government. And crop prices will begin to fall. This is all going to fuel the Panic of 1873. And by the late 1800s, you see reverse migration, again contributing to ghost towns. People move out there, they give it a shot, they can't make it work, they come back east. So this is a list of farmers' grievances that we'll see during this time period, things that are frustrating the farmers. And of course, we know that these will continue to grow and form these farmer alliances movement that we'll be talking about in the future in the Progressive Era. One of their problems is, one of their frustrations is that railroads are charging higher rates for farm goods than for industrial goods. It's not a secret. It's not something they're trying to hide. They also charge higher rates in the South and West than in the Northeast. The railroads also controlled elevator and warehouse facilities by buying centers and charging just exorbitant storage rates to farmers. So farmers tended to be charged, they were charged more than other people were for the exact same service that the railroad would provide. They want the government to regulate that. Another grievance, banks control credit, they control loans, and farmers are dependent on interest rates. And a lot of farmers had to pay loans back at really high interest rates at the exact same time that the prices for their produce was dropping. Prices, speaking of which, a farmer could plant a large crop when prices were high and expect to yield large profits, but by the time they harvested the crops and sold their crops, the prices had fallen. So they were frustrated by that, and they would like to have some fixed pricing. And then lastly, they're resentful to the federal government for protecting industry through the use of protective tariffs, but farmers' crops are continued to be sold in a tariff-free market. Life out west during this time period is very romanticized. You have the Rocky Mountain School of Art. You have novels that romanticize the cowboy, this idea of, masculine violence and American freedom meeting in this irresistible, pull. You have Wild West sideshows, people like Buffalo Bill Cody and Annie Oakley. People would pay money to see perform and show off this Western style of living. Mark Twain writes The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Theodore Roosevelt writes The Winning of the West. It makes him hugely popular. We know what he'll parlay that popularity into. In 1890, the government announces the frontier is closed. What does that mean? Well, it just means that there's no more what's out there. There's no more what's past this point and can we have it. There's no frontier line. And the frontier line is just defined as a point beyond which there are less than 2 people per square mile. It's filling up. Americans want an outlet. Frederick Jackson Turner writes a text called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, and he says, frontier fuels advancement. It fuels individualism. And without a frontier, what is America going to do? Of course, we know what comes next is imperialism, but it's an interesting question to ponder. He said, the frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history. So, of course, in part of this romanticized vision is this idea of a completely empty frontier. And we know that that's just not an accurate vision. Is the frontier empty? Of course it's not. Not only do Native Americans live there, who had lived there for generations and generations, but also the frontier is where we had forcibly put Native Americans that had been removed from the East. Remember Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act. So there are a couple of different theories about how to deal with Native Americans. And at the beginning of this time period, here is the working theory. You treat them as sovereign nations and you make and uphold treaties with them. But as time goes on and as the frontier dwindles, where can I go? Where can I settle? Where can we irrigate? Where can we live? And by we, I mean white Americans. Well, we can go where the natives are. What do we do with the natives? We have to figure that out. We have to move them. And this is where the idea of a traditional reservation will start to develop in the 1850s. Because before that, it was just put them here, now you live on this land. And then later it becomes this is a specific area designed for you. The other thing that happens with the continuation of the settling of the frontier is the disappearing of the buffalo. And as the buffalo disappear, so do a lot of Native American life. Just wanted to point out the Nez Perce and the Apache are two groups that we're really going to be talking about. The Sioux as well, where they are living. In 1851, the government adopts what's called a concentration policy, where all tribes are assigned to a plot of land. It's a defined land, but it is, to be sure, undesirable land, because if the white Americans want to move on to good land, they need to take it from the natives. And they're not going to put them on more good land. They're going to put them somewhere that they know is not going to be desirable to whites. Tribes are kept deliberately separate, and tribes who had worked together in the past to effect change, and the concentration policy will be in place until 1867. The Indian Peace Commission will recommend that Native Americans be kept on two large pieces of land, one piece existing in the Oklahoma Territory and the other piece existing in the Dakotas. This is what the Oklahoma Territory looks like. And remember the 5 civilized tribes that were living out east with Andrew Jackson, you'll find them here. The next few slides have some videos that have to do with conflicts with Native Americans, so I'm just going to play. They're short videos, but they do a good job summing up these events.
In the 1860s, the U.S. Army tried to herd Native Americans onto smaller and smaller parcels of land to make room for white settlers from the east. When negotiations with the Army failed, the Indians fought to keep their land, often in savage battles, like one that occurred 40 miles north of Fort Lyon, Colorado, at a place called Sand Creek.
The Sand Creek Massacre is probably one of the most horrific encounters between Native Americans and the U.S. federal government.
In 1864, about 800 Colorado militiamen attacked an unsuspecting band of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians who thought they were under federal protection.
They had signed a negotiation with the federal government where they had agreed to come into the reservation at Fort Lyon.
160 Indians were killed there, mostly women and children. The soldiers scalped or mutilated many of them.
It's difficult to talk about the kind of brutality, but the scalping of people, the maiming of people, Chivington's men actually taking the heads and scalps of women and children and parading them through the streets of Denver a week later when they come back into town.
Word of the killings spread rapidly.
It sent the Great Plains into an eruption of violence on both sides that was absolutely horrific. Native Americans retaliated not only against U.S. troops, but against homesteaders who were out on the Great Plains.
The cycle of violence continued for years as Native Americans were forced into smaller and smaller parcels of land. In 1877, a tribe of Indians called the Nez Perce tried to escape to Canada to avoid another massacre. They were led by a chief by the name of Joseph.
Chief Joseph really was somebody who saw the futility of trying to engage with the federal government or trying to combat federal troops who were out on the Great Plains, and really just wanted to remain separate. He wanted his people, the Nez Perce, to be able to stay within a particular area, to be left alone from both settlers and from the federal government.
Chief Joseph led his people on a 1,300-mile trek through the West. When the Army caught up with the Nez Perce, they promised to return them to their ancestral home in Idaho. Instead, they were sent to a dusty reservation in Kansas, where nearly half the tribe died from disease. Despite fierce resistance, the government's Indian removal policy ultimately succeeded. Indians who were once used to freely roaming the land were now confined to tiny reservations where their descendants remain to this day.
Okay. There's another one.
It's one of the most crushing defeats in American history. Custer's Last Stand. June 25th, 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and over 600 troopers of the 7th United States Cavalry arrive in the Little Bighorn Valley of southern Montana. The cavalry has come to subdue a village of defiant Indians. Thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne under the leadership of the great holy man, Sitting Bull. For a century, the United States has pushed the frontier west, herding tribe after tribe onto agencies or reservations. The Sioux and the Cheyenne don't want to give up their land on the northern plains. These last defiant Indians gather into a colossal wandering village. In the spring of 1876, the village arrives on the plains of Montana.
The village was always on the move. They knew the army was out after them. And to the United States Army, to capture a fleeing village was an impossible task.
Custer follows Sitting Bull's path west across the Wolf Mountains. On the other side, the Indian village stands on the banks of a slender river. The Indians call it the Greasy Grass. The Army calls it the Little Bighorn. On the morning of June 25th, Custer and his troops arrive in a treacherous landscape carved up into hidden channels and ravines. Perfect cover for fighters who know its contours. Deadly for the soldiers who don't. Around noon, Custer makes what many believe is his fatal mistake. He divides his forces into 3 separate columns. Custer heads up the bluffs along the river to attack from the north. It's his first clear look at the size of the village. He realizes he doesn't have enough troops to do the job. He sends a rider south with a note calling for more men and more ammo.
It's important to keep in mind that no one had any idea of how many Indians there would be. They simply had no idea.
Indians are surrounding Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his battalion. Survivors are struggling to join up with other troopers on nearby high ground. A spot now called Last Stand Hill.
The tables are turning for Custer. He's no longer the attacker, he's being attacked. Decides to take this high hill, which we call Last Stand Hill today. All the soldiers kill their horses to hide behind. A lot of the warriors said as they got close to this hill, they arched their arrows high into the sky, having those arrows come down behind those dead horses. They said, we rained arrows down on those men. Our shots quit coming, and we rushed up and we killed them all.
Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and over 200 of his men annihilated in a defeat that devastated America in 1876.
This battle, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, was the Plains Indians' greatest victory. This caused the government to send out more forces, more military.
Less than a year after the battle, Sitting Bull flees to Canada, and Crazy Horse surrenders in Nebraska. The Last Stand has been studied more closely than almost any military engagement in our history. Today, the battlefield still lies serene and empty, above the cottonwood trees lining the Little Bighorn River.
USS
The Apache Indians originally came from Canada. They migrated south to follow the bison, which took them to Texas and Arizona. They were often driven out of their land by settlers and soldiers, both from the United States and Mexico. The Apaches were excellent horsemen and used their horses to hunt bison. They would use the meat for food and the bones and hides to make teepees, tools, and even playing cards. In In 1875, the United States government made it illegal for Indians to migrate into Texas, and they provided them with reservations to live on and food to eat. Many Apache moved to the reservations, but many didn't want to. One Apache fought the soldiers often, and his name was Geronimo. His Indian name was Goyathle, which means one who yawns. During a battle between the Apache and Mexican soldiers, Geronimo's mother, wife, and children were killed. After that, he vowed to kill as many soldiers as possible, whether they were American or Mexican. After years of raiding enemies' posts and killing soldiers, General George Crook was determined to find Geronimo and his men. He was finally found near the Mexican-American border, and he surrendered. Geronimo was taken to the White Mountain Indian Reservation in Arizona, but 2 years later he escaped, and once again he was found, and he surrendered in 1886. Geronimo was captured and held prisoner until his death in 1909. He was 80 years old.
So one other event I want to mention is the ghost dance. There is a prophet, a Native American prophet. His name is Wovoka. Oh, sorry, kicked the desk. Wovoka. He has a series of visions that involved a particular dance, and performing this dance was, he said, would bring back the buffalo and also restore Native American lands. There is a movement for people to sort of ceremonially perform this dance amongst many different Plains Indian groups in the hope of affecting a positive outcome. The U.S. Army starts to become afraid, the U.S. government really, starts to become afraid of the ghost dance, and mostly afraid of the large gatherings of Native American groups that would come together to perform this ghost dance. And there is an event called Wounded Knee, where there is a gathering, the army gets spooked, ends up firing on the dancers, very peaceful gathering of dancers, and over 200 men, women, and children end up being killed at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee takes place in 1890, and it's considered to be the end of organized Native American resistance to removal. But it's important to know that it is not the end of Native American culture.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Just wanted us to see what a ghost dance would have looked like. So the video is not the best quality, but I know you guys have probably heard of the ghost dance before. Maybe you would like to see it. That's it. Assimilation. The U.S. government will eventually promote the idea of tribal destruction and assimilation. So they believed that the only way for there to be peaceful coexistence between Native Americans and U.S. settlers was to make them assimilate, the Native Americans assimilate. The only way to assimilate was to destroy a tribal structure. And so you're going to see the passage of something called the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. It will gradually eliminate tribal ownership of land. 160 acres of land will be given to the head of each family. Adult landowners will gain U.S. citizenship, but they cannot gain access to their property titles for 25 years. Sit with that for a moment. They get the land, but they can't get the title of that land for 25 years, even though at that point they would be U.S. citizens. Now, the reason for this is that Native Americans, this is according to the federal government, were incapable of appropriately administering that land, that they would be somehow wasteful, that they would be somehow ignorant of how to farm and manage their own property. So the government should do that for them, and then when they had proven sort of that they could be responsible, they would be given the property. Native American children, this is a really interesting topic under the Dawes Act. Now, the best way to get a culture to assimilate is to teach the children something different, and that's what the American government does. Children of Native Americans will be taken, essentially, and sent to boarding schools out east, where they will be taught how to be American, how to dress in an American style, how to be Christian, how to speak English, etc. This is the beginning of the attempted destruction of Native American culture on the part of the U.S. government. The Dawes Act is bad. It doesn't work, and it's horrible towards Native Americans, but the policy results in widespread corruption, little enforcement. The land that's promised to be given to landowners is never actually given to landowners, and so you just see the federal government seizing tribal land and never giving it to heads of households. This is I think, very disturbing image from a Pennsylvania school. I think these are Native American kids being educated and taught how to be American. This is a political cartoon, Dawes Act of 1877. You see the Dawes Act is chomping up Indian lands.